security is I would describe it a national security rock star. He is an author, columnist, political scientist. I know he was a Munich Security Council young leader. Richard, how are you? First of all, thanks so much for joining us.
Pleasure. Always good to join you guys.
I want to ask, can you just react, respond to what the president said? How was it received in the Philippines? And was he addressing a domestic audience? Was he addressing China? I mean, why did he say what he said?
Yeah, I think as far as President Marcos Jr. is concerned, he was definitely trying to engage the international media, and my sense is he tends to be much more engaging when he's dealing with actually Western or international media, especially in the United States or Europe or in this case in Australia. Actually, the news back in the Philippines did not concern his comments on the South China Sea or China, but some of the questions regarding his family's background. I mean, after all, we're talking about Ferdinand Marcos Jr., right? They're quite a notorious dynasty, to put it mildly, right? But this is the thing. If you look at the things that Marcos Jr. is saying about the South China Sea, um, there's nothing new there. I mean, these are the things that we were warning about throughout the years. These are the things that the late and former president Benigno Aquino Jr. was warning about in early 2010s. He's the president behind our unprecedented decision, and in many ways historic decision, to take China to international court. But the reason why Marcos Jr. suddenly sounds like a breath of fresh air, ironically, for that matter, is because we had 6 years of Rodrigo Duterte, a president who was, to put it mildly, really from an alternative universe when it comes to anything regarding the South China Sea issue. If you listen to the interviews that the former president gave on the South China Sea issues, he was always trying to essentially lawyer or apologize for China. So now I think President Marcos Jr. is saying the correct things, something that the experts have been warning about. We know that President Xi Jinping is not excited about starting a war. We know that President Xi Jinping is focused on the economic troubles at home. But at the rate things are going, if China continues to send an armada of militia forces, unprofessional forces, of trigger-happy maritime forces to the South China Sea, it's just a matter of time before some sort of accidental clashes escalate into something much bigger.
Richard, thanks so much for that. You were breaking up a little bit there, so I don't quite think I got the back half of that. But point taken about the difference between the Duterte administration and the Marcos Jr. administration. Can we just follow up on the comment from one of the people online regarding this treaty? What does the treaty actually say? What are the U.S. obligations, and what is the sense and confidence that from the Philippines that the Americans will stick to whatever they have promised?
Yeah, I'm actually, well, currently in Japan, as you mentioned a while ago. If you look at the mutual defense treaty between Japan and the United States, that treaty is pretty clear about America's obligations to come to Japan's rescue if ever it's invaded by a third party, for that matter, let's say China. But in the case of the Philippines and the United States, there's a certain inbuilt ambiguity into the mutual defense treaty. In fact, for instance, there has to be some sort of a buy-in or some sort of a, implied veto by other branches of the U.S. government, let's say the U.S. Congress, for instance. So there is a degree of ambiguity, and that degree of ambiguity actually was very much central to America's approach to the South China Sea issue during the Nixon administration all the way to the Obama administration. But towards the end of the, well, first Trump administration, and some would think, hopefully, maybe first Trump administration, and now under the Biden administration, we see a political decision to diminish that ambiguity. So since 2018 and 19, we have multiple American administrations saying that if the Philippines troops, vessels, or aircrafts were to be attacked by any third force in the South China Sea, that could invoke the mutual defense treaty between the United States and the Philippines.
Frozen up. I was hoping that it come through, and after all, he is in Osaka, where one would think the internet is pretty fast. And
My apologies for that. I'm surprised too. Yeah.
but I think we got our answer in terms of just the mutual defense treaty that the United States has with the Philippines. It looks like the Americans, if they really didn't want to engage with China on this matter in the South China Seas, they have an out through Congress and through other mechanisms. And because we're trying to reconnect connect with Richard, I think this is a good time to try to bring in Colin. Does
Mr. Heydarian, I call you again in a second because sometimes the connection drops.
Yeah, I'm wondering what's going on. Yeah, with my internet. No problem. No problem. My apologies for that too.
thank you so much for joining us. Gujarat School of International Studies. Thank you so much for joining us. We really, really appreciate it. Absolutely. So we were just talking to Richard about sort of the why Marcos Jr. Said what he said. And of course, Richard explained a little bit about the Mutual Defense Treaty and the U.S. obligation to that. I'm a little curious. Do you like? Why has the Philippines become more wary of China under Marcos Jr.?
Hello, this is the sound control room again, and let's just check. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you guys pretty well. I don't know what happened. Well,
Great,
things.
we put you on air. Yeah.
My apologies. Yeah.
Very much sort of often circulated assumption that everything all started under the current administration. That's not exactly.
Hi, Richard, this is Dustin Producer again. We'll try to get you in the conversation now. I'll let them know you're back.
Of
Pleasure,
Duterte's
thank you.
administration that is considered rather abnormal. To give you context, during the time when Duterte was president, throughout the 6 years, public surveys in the Philippines highlighted a few important, I would say, characteristics. I think one is that Duterte himself, as a president, was pretty popular amongst the people. He was sort of, praised and given pretty high public approval ratings on various areas, such as, for example, how he handled the COVID-19, how he handled the economy in general, how he handled internal security. But there's one area that he consistently didn't do very well, has been his approach to China. And by the extension, it is also with regard to how the public in the Philippines perceive China and the South China Sea issue. So I think that has been pretty consistent. But as what Richard had rightly pointed out, Duterte had somewhat preferred to lawyer for China throughout his 6 years, and he had reached some form of agreements with China. Those are not written agreements, but appear to have been verbal agreements that were not institutionalized, but they were nonetheless taken as a concrete form agreement by China. And of course, that seems to have changed. And I thought the change started around early 2020, during the time when there was the COVID-19. That was a time when China was going around and somehow getting to some pretty serious incidents with the various South China Sea parties in Southeast Asia, like the case of Indonesia, the case of Malaysia, with West Capella. And then you would think that China would somehow leave the Philippines alone, given that Duterte was somewhat taken as the poster boy of Sino-Philippine relationship after the Aquino administration back then. But I think it was all proven wrong, because in 2021, Sun Reef incident blew up. And I think that was what I believe to be the turning point of Duterte's policy towards China. We saw, for example, Duterte rescinded the earlier decision to scrap the visiting forces agreement with the U.S. And thereafter, in the final months, what we saw was a much harder stance towards China in terms of how the Philippines deploy maritime forces. And so essentially, Marcos Jr. administration built on that.
Very interesting, and there's lots of comments, particularly about what's what's going on in the Philippines. And Richard has rejoined us, so questions for either. So this is from Pomni, who just states it is obvious that the Philippines is trying to hedge between the two giants. In other words, between the U.S. and between China. Is that correct? Yeah, Richard, if you since you got knocked off, why don't you answer that one?
Yeah, a problem being sabotaged Probably some people didn't like my answers a while ago. It always happens to me, but I was surprised it happens to me in Japan. I thought this is a safe space. Well, I mean, Colin is right. I mean, actually, even towards the end of the Duterte administration, 2021, he openly called out China and essentially said, "Hey, you don't do this to your friends." This is, if I'm not mistaken, during the ASEAN China summit in 2021. Now, going back to your
Hedging its bets.
yes, yes,
Between
yes. Speaking
two
of
great
hedging, yeah, yeah.
giants, the US and China.
Well, hedging, I always say it's like 50 shades of hedging, right? Across the Southeast Asian region. All of us are hedging in one way or another. And in the Philippines, different administrations have been hedging differently. Even Duterte was hedging at some point, but he was tilting far more towards China than the United States. If you look at President Marcos Jr., he has also been hedging. Initially, actually, he also wanted a new era of golden relationship with China. He said that when he met Wang Yi in 2022, just a few months after he won, he called Xi Jinping and said, "We are going to shift our relationship to a higher ground." And this is where you can see China is not a very sophisticated rising power. Everyone talks about, especially there in Europe, I always hear Chinese statecraft, sophistication. I don't see that. They had a golden opportunity with Duterte to seal the deal, to come up with at least some white elephant projects, but all they offered us was pledge trap. Forget about debt trap, because in debt trap, there's investment. In the Philippines, there was just empty pledges, nothing came in, and then they tried to do that to Marcos Jr. Except Marcoses, unlike Duterte's, are OG, right? They have been in this geopolitical business for decades. I mean, you can find pictures of Marcos Jr. with Mao Zedong in the 70s. So you're not gonna pull off what you pulled off with Duterte with Marcos Jr. So when Marcos Jr. last January went to China, he only had 2 days, unlike his father who had like 10 days, I think, when he was there in the 70s. He brought in hundreds of Filipino businessmen, including Chinese Filipino businessmen, and he got really nothing. China did not offer any compromise on the South China Sea issue, any compromise on the unfulfilled investments, and only a few weeks after that, you see a dramatic change in Marcos Jr. tone, especially in the World Economic Forum. And then the following month, he green-lighted not only expansion of the Philippines' military cooperation with the United States, but also with Japan. So there are now conversations with a trilateral security cooperation among Japanese and Filipinos and Americans, also focusing on Taiwan, not only on the South China Sea. So this hedging is not like, there's a software you download and then, this is president's hedging one. No. The presidents are responding to China's own actions and calculus. So Colin's absolutely right. China has been trying to have the cake and eat it too, and they have been really abusing so the strategic opportunism of China, coupled with their inability to make the most out of their strategic opening in the Philippines, is why we are where we are today. So what really annoys me with China's rhetoric nowadays is twofold. One is dismissing the Philippines as a pawn of the United States when we're not defending America's territory, we're defending the Philippines' sovereign rights. And number two, completely denying the Philippines strategic agency, when in fact the Philippines is doing this for its own national interest, right? Not for anyone's national interest. And we're defending our own sovereign rights. So I call this strategic gaslighting. China is gaslighting the Philippines for doing what is right. And they're now gaslighting Marcos Jr. when Marcos Jr. is doing nothing genius. He's just continuing what Aquino was doing 7-8 years ago, except because Duterte came before him, he suddenly looks like the hero of the day.
Right. That is fascinating.
I just wanted to say that your 9 shades of hedging was well liked in the chat. Scotch and salmon roll, that's a great name. Scotch and salmon roll certainly liked it, and others. I mean, there are lots of questions generally about China and views about what China's going to do with the Philippines, but I don't know if now is the time to mention that, or whether
let's hold on that. We're going to talk about sort of the 50,000 feet, sort of China, why China thinks the way it does. But before we do that, I think it'd be fun, our idea of fun, to talk about the boats on the sea. Like, I know that sounds so simple, but we often in news talk about a skirmish on the South China Sea. What is actually happening on these waters? How many ships are there? Are there just Chinese Coast Guard ships like we saw in the video? What is the strength of the Philippine Navy? We, of course, know that the Americans talk about freedom of the navigation of the seas there. So are they out there? Like, many countries, I imagine, must be represented on these waters. I'm trying to wrap my head around it. I just want to say, this is a really busy global trade route. I've read articles like 20 to 30% of global trade. Correct me if I'm wrong, Richard or Colin, but I mean, there's a lot of boats out there. So, and this military activity going on. So yeah, I'd love to know, like, what's it like? Yeah, and while we're talking about this, guys, both of you, so you're aware, I mean, Michelle has a lot of maps teed up and graphs. So as you're talking, if you want to describe something geographically, we can zoom in and do all kinds of things like that. So Colin, can you just start, like, just broad strokes, like what is actually bobbing out there on the waters?
Oh, sorry. Is there a specific area that you want to look at?
Okay, so South China Seas, are we seeing American ships? Are we seeing more Chinese ships? Is it just a potpourri of different countries' navies out there? I mean, I guess for someone who doesn't study the military, it's hard to wrap my mind around what's actually happening in the context of these skirmishes, right? Like, these ocean waters are vast.
The South China Sea appear on the map to be pretty small, but it is still a large semi-enclosed sea body. And we are looking at a very complex, what we call pattern of life of maritime activity. So if you talk about not just government vessels, we are looking at a whole array of civilian vessels, ranging from the big tankers, container ships, and coastal freighters, and I think more commonly also we're looking at offshore support vessels that were supporting the offshore energy activities, and of course I think most prevalently will be the fishing vessels of various sizes. But there is not really a sort of a off the account figure on what each country tends to have. But let's just focus on a few countries, right? For China, I think in terms of the offshore presence, that actually has been pretty more dominant vis-a-vis the Philippines and even vis-a-vis the US. Why I say that? For China, over the 1 decade or so, it has managed to build two things. One would be the fleet of Coast Guard as well as Navy vessels. And of course, secondly, would be those artificial islands that started to appear after 2014.
And hold on 1 second. Yeah, Michelle's going to pull up the artificial islands or the first, I think it'd be good to look at the Chinese naval fleet. We've got an infographic as of 2015 that shows what kind of ships that are part of the Chinese fleet. And you were just mentioning the Coast Guard there, Colin. Down here, we've got the Chinese Coast Guard ships. I'm going to zoom in here. Everybody bear with me. Yeah, and Colin, I didn't want to interrupt your thought, but please continue your thought while Michelle pulls these visuals up for us. And I know Jared's probably going to drop the link in. So, yeah, for those of you who want to follow along. Sorry, Colin. So you were saying, yes, about these. This is the largest buildup of the Chinese Navy. And I understand that the Chinese Navy is now larger than the United States one. I don't know by what metric. Is that true?
It's true. In terms of the number of ships built per year, China's shipbuilding capacity dwarfs what the US has been able to do within 1 year on average. This is a very phenomenal build-up by China, not just for the Navy itself, but also for the Coast Guard. We are looking at a phenomenal growth of the Coast Guard and Navy, and of course we are even looking at the maritime militia, sort of boasting pretty capable vessels as well. So
Colin, I'm so sorry. Can I jump in there, because we've got an infographic that is directly related to what you're talking about right now, kind of comparing the U.S. versus Chinese Navy fleets. So I'm just going to bring that graphic in here. So this says over time. This is the Chinese naval fleet back here in 2000. And then it shows we're right here, right around 2024. It definitely is bigger than the U.S. Navy fleet and is projected to be way bigger. Do you mind talking about why this is happening, this difference in trajectory between the two navies?
Okay, so I will summarize more concisely on that. Now, we are looking at, of course, on the one hand, a PLA Navy that is, rather busy trying to modernize a whole huge fleet of Cold War era vessels. And thereby, what we're seeing here is what we call a block replacement of a huge number of ships within a short span of time. Those legacy vessels that belong to the Cold War are progressively being decommissioned and replaced with relatively newer and younger vessels. Whereas on the other hand, for the US, while it has a much higher baseline of more capable vessels, but they dated back earlier, say in the 80s and say in the early 90s, and gradually as they age, they become less available and then they sort of get decommissioned. Now, the one thing that we are seeing here is that the US Navy is not building as quickly as it would to replace the ships that it will want to decommission. So, for example, just this week, the financial year or fiscal year 2025 budget request for the US Navy means that more than 10 vessels will be decommissioned, but only 6 ships will be ordered for that fiscal year. So as you can see, the replacement isn't catching up with the decommissioning. So in other words, we are seeing here the shrinking of the US Navy. And on the other hand, we're looking at the expansion of the Chinese Navy. Now, the Chinese Navy fleet, as represented by the graphic, you need to give up some context to it. One is that the Chinese Navy still actually has a huge fleet of smaller vessels. Smaller vessels like corvettes and patrol craft and fast attack craft, usually they are more useful in the littorals or the coastal waters. Whereas for the US Navy, the bulk of its fleet are actually blue water capable vessels. But the only problem here is that for the Chinese Navy, they have the luxury of focusing on regional hotspots that were close to shore. But the US Navy, the global Navy that has wide-ranging responsibility, so they can't focus like the Chinese Navy on one single region. So the trend that you are presenting here is something that we are going to see as a structural problem going forward.
That is fascinating. And while we continue this conversation, Michelle, why don't you just pull up the man-made islands visuals, and we can talk over that about other stuff.
Yeah,
because Colin, I know you were getting to it.
Well, just from the chat, picking up on the Navy, bad Matt's 18, and China's Navy is larger, but it's made in China. That's the point there that Colin was making. And also, quite a few comments just about the strength of the Chinese Navy coming in. And Ed Rojas, the days of grand naval battles are over, he says. Obviously, well, maybe that's controversial, actually, but I guess he's talking about the fact that the Chinese, it's so much bigger at the moment than the American Navy anyway, particularly in that part of the world. But quite a few comments, a lot of interest, can I say, in the Navy and the ships and the actual, what they are. So if we know anything more about that, that would be great to get any more info, because there's interest in it. Let's bring in Richard, because you've been listening to all this. Can you tell us just a little bit about what's the thinking behind the Chinese building these man-made islands? There are these amazing before and after photos. Is this, again, trying to plant their flag on the soil and sort of claim it? If you look at these, they're just building out these military assets. Is it strategic or is it just symbolic? What's going on here?
Well, I think it's all of the above. There's definitely this symbolic value to this. And there's the legal aspect to it, or at least that's the hope of China, because as far as international law is concerned, effective and continuous exercise of jurisdiction is one way of proving that you have sovereignty over a certain territory. Except, of course, China is never going to be open to taking these cases to international court. But that also gives them a kind of a psychological and symbolic edge. But militarily speaking, I'm sure
changing the facts on the ground, essentially.
Changing facts, and we see this all around the world, right? In disputed territories, the party that has the upper hand in terms of changing facts on the ground, over time creates some sort of psychological reality, a political reality for that matter. Now, militarily, I remember very well back in 2013 when China went on this kind of geoengineering on steroids. There were many dismissive commentaries coming out of the United States. Many people in the US Navy and Pentagon were saying, we can just bomb that thing in a few hours, they'll be gone. But I think more and more studies throughout the years, I'm sure Colin has his own take on this, have shown that it could actually give China some significant amount of military prowess, especially when dealing with the smaller powers in the region, but perhaps also vis-a-vis America. And more importantly, remember, China has not reached the final phase of its strategy in the South China Sea. So I think it's now perhaps only in phase 3. So first phase was reclamation. Second phase was militarizing those fake islands. Third is what I call militiaization, meaning using militia forces, fake, fishermen to create intimidation tactics, but short of the threshold of triggering war or the Philippines Mutual Defense Treaty. But we know that the final phase would really be China declaring an air defense identification zone, meaning completely dominating the skies in the area as a way to dominate the seas in the area. And that means it will have to have a network of air bases and all sorts of defense capabilities in the area. So it has an end goal. But just to be clear about this, as far as
that reminds me,
yeah.
You talk about the air defense identification zone. That's what it's doing to Taiwan, right? That's where we're seeing that the jets flying in the ADIZ. Do you guys call it ADIZ or ADIZ? I don't know.
Yes, yes.
So you're saying that they're kind of taking that strategy that they have with Taiwan and sort of expanding it to the South China Seas or the West Philippine Sea, depending, right?
Yeah, Melissa, fantastic point. Actually, the Taiwan angle is very important. I think many strategists would say that one way of China also dominating Taiwan and winning over Taiwan is to secure the rear of Taiwan, and the rear of Taiwan will be the South China Sea, and to a certain degree the Philippines, something that we can discuss later on. So you really cannot separate this thing. I mean, we tend to separate East China Sea, Taiwan Straits, South China Sea, but China today treats all of these bodies of waters as an integrated theater of operation. So all of the things that they're doing on the ground is part of that strategy. Now, as far as the Philippines is concerned, the latest tensions, I would say there are essentially 3 areas. One is in the Scarborough Shoal. Perhaps you can pull it up in the map. It's just over 100 nautical miles off the Philippines Luzon island, the northern island, when the capital Manila is. We see a lot of tensions there. In fact, in 2012, we saw a months-long naval standoff between the Philippines and China there. And that was really the wake-up call for the Philippines, because for almost a century, the Philippines essentially outsourced its external security needs to the United States of America. It was a very peculiar, and I would say as a Filipino, quite an embarrassing situation for quite some time. But we were shaken out of that stupor, and since 2012, we have been engaging in a modernization of our armed forces. Now, China is just so big that they make all of us look small, but I think the Philippines has a good chance of becoming a credible middle power, modern power later this decade. But the 2 other areas are, of course, in the Spratly group of islands, particularly around Tito Island, and the other one where we see a lot of really violent, potentially explosive tensions is the second Thomas Shoal, which you mentioned a while ago. We have a grounded ship there since 1998. We have a de facto marine detachment there. We have been resupplying our people there, but the Chinese are preventing us. Yes, this is the Sierra Madre.
We have pictures of it, and while we're pulling those pictures up, this is exactly the kind of this is the question I want to ask. We've been looking at the strength of the Chinese Navy. We've talked a little bit about the assumed strength of the Americans. What is the strength of the Philippine Navy? I mean, you're talking about the Philippines needing to exert, and its sovereignty over the waters that it believes it controls. And then yet we have these images of the Sierra Madre. It doesn't look great. Let's pull it up. Is it Michelle or Dustin that has this? These photos?
I've got this on my laptop. I'm going to try and make it bigger here. So this is what we've got. This is, you can see, it's just really a
rust bucket,
a rusted hulk. I mean, I've read
accounts. It's a tetanus-friendly site. I would say it's a tetanus-friendly site. It's a horrible site as far as the Philippines' position is. But this reflects the horrible strategic decisions made by former Filipino presidents, right? None of them, actually, the last Filipino president who was forward-looking and did something on the ground. Remember, 1977, 78. The Philippines already had a modern airstrip in that area. That was under Ferdinand Marcos Sr. I'm no fan of dictators, but if there's one thing that guy got right, was on foreign policy. That's why Kissinger and Nixon were worried that they could get dragged into a war, hence your question on the Mutual Defense Treaty. The reason why America was ambiguous was because the Philippines was the mini bully. Back then, we had the best armed forces, or among the best in Southeast Asia, but for 30 years, the Philippines was an economic doldrum, strategic neglect, but we're coming back. So Philippines obviously is not 10 out of 10, and China makes all of us look pathetic in certain ways, but we're going from, let's say, 1 or 2 towards 5, 6, or 7 out of 10 in the coming years or so. So I think the Philippines have come very far, especially if you look at the Philippine Coast Guard. I'm sure Colin has to say something about this, but I think Philippine Coast Guard right now is among the best in the Southeast Asian region. And some of the new vessels they have, they're pretty fancy. I've been in many, many modern vessels all around the world. Colin knows that. But the ones I'm seeing in the Philippines right now are very encouraging, thanks to, not because they're my host right now, but also thanks to Japan. Former President Shinzo Abe, among others, made sure countries like the Philippines on the front line will get that capacity building help. So the Philippines is nowhere close to China, but it's getting closer to becoming at least a David versus the Goliath of China if the current trends continue.
And let me just pick up on that, because Jetpack Russia has said a modernization in the Navy which is paid for and supplied by ... the US. Is that correct?
No, not at all. Actually, I completely agree with one of the comments earlier. Like, we have been with the Americans shoulder to shoulder. How many world wars? By the way, First World War, Second World War, Cold War, Vietnam War, Korean War. So, I mean, just look at the amount of aid America is giving to countries, Ukraine. Of course, I understand it's a war situation. Or look at some countries in the Middle East, countries that are not even U.S. treaty allies, like Jordan or Egypt. You know, Israel is a totally different level, or Pakistan. These are countries who have been getting billions of dollars in aid. They're getting advanced weapon systems, F-16s, Abrams tanks. The Philippines, until quite recently, we were getting Vietnam-era kind of weapon systems from the Americans. So as I said, it was really under Trump and Biden that things have begun to change. But the Philippines is not just going to rely on the Americans anymore. We're reaching out to the Americans. As we speak, President Marcos Jr. is there in Germany talking to Chancellor Scholz, or was talking to Chancellor Scholz. We're looking at France for potential acquisition of submarine. So we're finally looking at a whole network of partners and allies, because we know we cannot just rely on the Americans.
And are any more questions? Maybe I just throw one to call.
Well, just let me pick up on one thing that has come up in the chat by somebody called Randy Rowdy, who seems to be making a suggestion that the chat is being done by AI, and I can tell you 100% is not. I am looking at it, and Jared across from me is looking at it, and together we are trying to read all your comments. So please understand, we are not using AI. I'm sure it'd be a lot easier if we were, but we're not. Hence wearing glasses. Yeah, so that was important, just to point that out. So yes, we do make mistakes and read things incorrectly, but we are trying to do it the best we can. Yeah, so I just wanted to say that point. And
do we have any questions for Colin, maybe?
For Colin, we've got quite a few coming up about China and the US, but I think we probably don't want to get onto that yet. But I have a question that I would like to ask, which is about, you're talking about coast guards. These fishermen that we seem to be seeing on both sides, particularly on the Chinese side, are they fishermen that we're seeing, or are they militia people in disguise? Because I seem to be reading two different accounts on that.
Yeah, they seem to be very adventurous fishermen.
Yes. Colin, can you help us on that?
Okay. Yeah. The Chinese maritime militia is essentially, what we call a reservist force for the most part. They have in Hainan a force that is designed as a core force that is equipped with specialized vessels. There are some of these specialized vessels that were actually, very active in the South China Sea. Now, give you the context. The average age of maritime militia personnel is aging. So younger maritime militiamen are not as motivated as more senior counterparts or their predecessors. And usually, what happened was that during the time when there was a fishing ban, by right, the maritime militia personnel will undergo some refresher training. But in the recent years, the trend had been that these maritime militiamen, they would prefer to find jobs on land during those times when there was no fishing. And many of them may not necessarily undergo the training. So recognizing that the Chinese thereby also created a specialized force within Hainan especially. But for the most part, it's not right to say that all of them are maritime militia vessels. It's also not right to say that none of them maritime Malaysia vessel. The issue here is that they don't wear uniforms. They do wear uniforms during their training and during parades. But on any normal day, they're out there fishing. Even in daytime, while they are operating as fishermen, they have the obligation to take part in activities when called upon by the Navy or by the Coast Guard. And of course, they have to report any sort of anomalous activities that they encounter that will require their authorities' attention. So what I'm trying to say is that, those fishermen, whether you are looking at them, being put there for specialized or specific maritime mission duty or just fishing duties, that they essentially play a part in asserting China's sovereignty.
So fishermen, soldiers. But are they paid? Are they paid extra for doing those special? I mean, I suppose you can't call them missions, but well, maybe you can call them missions. But are they paid extra by the Chinese to do that?
Okay, so I will quickly draw on that. For sure, depending on the missions that they are assigned to, they may get additional allowances. On top of that, the more common practice is that they get pretty heavy state subsidies for things like fuel, ship maintenance and repairs. That cover a lot of the costs, in fact. And in fact, suffice to say, put it bluntly, is that even if there's no fish out there, the government sees it fit to actually pay them and foot the bills to send them out there because they are essentially floating pieces of sovereignty. So therefore, we don't underestimate the fact that even if there are no fish out in the South China Sea, they still play an important role, and it's a political one.
That's fascinating. And before we go any further, though, Jared, what's been cooking online?
Well, just in terms of the fishermen, Harry Namkung says some are fishermen, some are militia. Interesting comment. We are being accused of fear-mongering and slander towards China. So I think that there's a lot of different heated opinions on exactly what we're talking about. But that was one opinion. Someone else has written here, China is acting like a bully. Of course, when we're talking about China in this context, it's easy to sort of make a link to Russia, which is what this person's done. Much similar to Russia, but less aggressive, but they are completely dependent on Western consumers, which buy their goods. We can stop buying, according to FJE. One comment that I kind of wanted to point out, some people are talking every so often about The Hague, and that is because an international tribunal ruled in 2016 dismissing Beijing's claim.
Right, Michelle
to
had
much
mentioned
of
that earlier.
the South China Sea, exactly what you were talking about. Of course, that seems to have had little impact on what China's been doing, but some people pointing out that the Philippines maybe themselves failed to capitalize on that ruling.
Right.
They could have been more assertive at the time, but they weren't, and maybe they've missed that opportunity. Some people think that.
I mean, China's been making hay in a sense in terms of the buildup that we've seen. We've got some pictures of the before and after if we want to get to that at some point, but go ahead.
Just quickly, just picking up on the fishermen again, Amber Drake reporting to duty when called is 100% a militia reserve force. So this whole thing about that, it's just a bit of an allowance. Obviously, Amber Drake does not believe that.
Well, so, I mean, I'm the fear mongering. Let's get into that. I mean, for those of you still just joining, we've been talking about the question: China and the Philippines, Asia's next hot war, and someone accusing the conversation of being too much fear mongering when it comes to China. I want to present that question to both of our guests, Richard and Colin. We've spent time looking at what's actually happening on the waters. Let's pull back now. Why is this fear-mongering? Why is China interested in this region? Is it ideological? Is it nationalistic? What's going on here? Maybe we should start with Richard, since Colin was speaking.
Well, I mean,
earlier.
I'm sure Colin also has a lot of quote-unquote followers / trolls there who are happy to always bash whatever we say here. But this is precisely what I've been saying, this gaslighting that they're doing to countries. I mean, all we're doing is just calling out some of the excesses there. The Philippines wants to have a good relationship with China. We have an interest in having a good relationship with China. We don't want to have war with China. But China cannot expect us not to say anything when they're essentially slapping us around, intimidating us. Several Filipino naval personnel, including a vice admiral, commander in the Philippine West Command near the South China Sea disputed areas, were injured during one of these operations. So to say the Philippines is the fearmonger is quite rich from some of the people who are clearly sympathetic to the other side. I mean, China always does it. It escalates the situations, it tries to impose its will, it bullies its way around, and if someone says something, they'll say, oh, you're provoking. Oh, you're trying to make things, you're making drama, right? You're a drama queen, right? They always do that. It's classic strategic gaslighting. Having said that, though, it is important that we don't forget the value of diplomacy. So I think I appreciate President Marcos Jr.'s tone, because as much as President Marcos Jr. points out the dangers and threats on the ground, if you look at his tone, he always tries to extend an olive branch to China. He went to China last year. He met President Xi Jinping on the sidelines of APEC last November. He is open to have negotiations with them, but the red lines of the Philippines as a sovereign nation should be respected. If China wants to be seen as a peaceful rising power, it has to respect some of the basic sovereign rights of neighboring countries. So that is why, I mean, if this is fear mongering, then what do we call people just water cannoning other countries' navy and injuring people right and left? Then that's what warmongering.
Well, Devos says in the chat, this isn't fear-mongering. This is talking about something that could lead to a world war situation.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, Colin, can you? I'd love to hear your thoughts. I mean, is this? How would you respond to the person who is saying that this is fear-mongering? And what is the ideological drive of China? If you can get into the psychology of Beijing a little bit for us.
Okay, so I will first tackle the second question. I think that is probably something that interests many of our audience here. There is no one single reason why China wants the spread list, or more broadly those contested South China Sea archipelagos. There are various reasons for that, and all of them, I believe, are equally important. One has to do with emotion, right? That the South China Sea was variously referred to in China as a historical blue territory. The use of the word blue territory is a very strong one, because if you go by international law, you don't claim waters as territory beyond your 12 nautical miles territorial sea. It's simple as that. So that is one. Of course, there is a clear economic stake in the South China Sea. We'll talk about the fishery, we'll talk about the hydrocarbon resources, and for China, these days they're talking about some form of methane deposit that is considered what they call a next generation energy source. We're talking about the strategic value, and you bring in Taiwan, and I fully agree with what Richard has said earlier, that both the South China Sea and Taiwan are seen as a contiguous whole. The South China Sea essentially is the southern flank of any future potential conflict over Taiwan. So therefore, it's important. And the fourth one is that if you look at the open source intelligence material, it's very clear that the South China Sea has become a key arena for China's sea-based nuclear deterrent. Most of its nuclear submarines, or in fact, one would say all of its nuclear ballistic missile submarines, are all based in Hainan. And the South China Sea is believed to be what they call a safe sanctuary for those ballistic missile submarine from which they could launch their missiles and be safe from any potential action from the enemy. So there are a whole slew of these reasons to underpin why the South China Sea is so important to China. But one thing to note is that the current ruling Communist Party has to go on with the current narrative, because doing otherwise is going to be detrimental to its political legitimacy. One will argue that over the time, national education in China has been very successful, but the CCP also finds itself a victim of its own success, because basically you are talking about a young generation of Chinese citizens who are born and raised in an era where they saw no hardship. Essentially, they are born in an era where China is strong, and they expect China to be strong. They expect the ruling party to fight back against any perceived grievances, say on the South China Sea, without hesitation. So therefore, in a way, it is public diplomacy also for CCP. Now, to address the second question, and of course, going back to the first question, I really wanted to weigh in on what Richard has said about whether we are fear mongering. Look, just to share with you, I've been looking at the South China Sea as part of my research on Southeast Asia, naval affairs, and maritime security for the past 10 years at least. And I saw the trends, I documented the incidents, and I think it's very clear that we are seeing here a very dangerous situation. Now, you remember, back in 2020 when all the Southeast Asian countries are busy trying to cope with a new menace, and that is COVID-19.
Right.
China wasn't letting up. China was essentially making use of the distraction of COVID-19 to basically poke the eye of the various Southeast Asian parties in the South China Sea. Indonesia, Malaysia, and then the following year in 2021, we saw the Philippines become the next victim. Essentially, China doesn't really care. Now, my advice to those who want to argue that we are fear mongering is first go and do your research, right? Don't just read certain newspaper, don't just read certain social media. Do your research, and trust the scholars who are doing impartial research. And we present, hard data just to show you. For example, people who say that, this thing about maritime militia doesn't exist. Let me share with you. If you have access to the Chinese database, which is an academic database, for example, National Knowledge Infrastructure, or CNKI, or even Wanfang, you will have all the ton of, Chinese literature on the maritime militia. And let me share with you, there is one Chinese journal called the Journal of the Militia, okay? And all those papers on maritime militia are all written by their officers, okay? And political commissars, high-ranking officers, and even senior scholars. Tell me whether they exist or not, okay? They exist, and it's very clear what they are writing about, with regard to what they want to do, what they need to do. And of course, there is a whole slew of journals on the China Coast Guard, essentially highlighting.
You're recommending you're recommending articles from China, but this is a perfect opportunity for you and Richard to showcase and share to viewers articles and journal pieces that both of you guys have put out. So I just want to throw that out there. You're far too humble, Colin. Tell us what you've written and in what media, so that people who are online right now can Google search it and read some of the things that you've been writing recently.
Maybe you want to ask Richard to go first?
Finish your thought. I mean, you're in such a role. Why don't you tell us like 2 articles or journal articles
Go ahead, buddy.
From you that we should all be, and then Richard, you get ready with your plug as well.
Okay, I roughly remember the year that I wrote some of those articles were around 2017, 2018, and they were published with the national interest. You can Google my name and the national interest, and you'll find articles that I wrote on the maritime militia and the China Coast Guard, for example. There is this piece that I wrote on the Chinese maritime militia that was published with the Heritage Foundation just a few years back as well. So you can look at them. I recommend. Obviously, if you read Chinese and you have access to databases, that's when you find a whole gem of knowledge regarding, what the Chinese maritime militia is doing and what they're thinking about in the future, what the China Coast Guard is doing, what challenges they face, and what are the things they want to do, all written by Chinese scholars and practitioners, okay? And you did say that if anyone says you are fear-mongering, hey, look, are you trying to say that, the Chinese themselves are fear-mongering themselves, okay? So I just want to end that.
Yes, this is what they're saying, that they're going to do and their intentions. So Richard, over to you. What should we be looking up? Articles, a podcast? You do so many different things.
Well, I mean, I don't know, probably 1,000 articles I've written on South China Sea, but these are popular articles, and a dozen probably academic articles. But at least I have 2 books which focus on the South China Sea, either directly or at least a chapter or 2 where I focus on that. One is the Asia's New Battlefield. I wrote it back in 2015, and the Indo-Pacific, more a recent book. But I have another book on China's relations with Southeast Asian countries, with South China Sea obviously also prominent there, hopefully coming out later this year with Melbourne University Press. But if you don't want to read my stuff, just follow me online and you'll get the more, I don't know, juicy, sexy version of my academic works. So because I wear many hats, so it depends which version of mine do you want to see, yeah.
Very various shades of
Various
race.
shades.
I think I'm not gonna be invited anymore. But forgive me, it's 12 p.m. It's almost midnight here in Japan, so I'm not at my sharpest. I'm sorry.
No. I mean, but guys, Richard and Colin, stay with us. But I want to, at this time, since we threw up that poll at the very beginning of this discussion, we had thrown up a poll. You might have missed it if you were, but it's actually online all the time.
Yes.
Jared, I think you have been following that. Can you just tell us what the results have been and what's
Yeah.
going on over there?
Exactly. So the poll was asking, what do you think is more likely, a Chinese conflict with the Philippines or a Chinese conflict with Taiwan? At the moment, we have a bit over 1,000 votes. 32% of people, I'll start with the least actually, so 28% of people say there'll be no conflict, 32% of people believe that there'll be conflict with the Philippines, and coming out on top is a conflict with Taiwan on 40%.
But there's a but to this, isn't there? Because although there's over 1,000 votes so far, there was another poll, wasn't there, before,
That's right.
before the stream
Technical
began?
glitch.
We had some technical issues, so we had a poll that had started before the stream, but
Quite
it
a lot of
got,
people voted.
yeah, so we probably had roughly double these amount of votes. That half of them got deleted by accident. These things
By
happen,
accident.
but I think it was roughly
The same
similar
results.
figures. So
Okay, the internet has spoken.
Yeah.
And let me just pick up on a couple of more comments that we've had, just talking about the situation with China and what's it trying to do. We have here, Pomni, China can't just let go of claims because they need that legitimacy of a strong China.
That's what Colin just said.
That's what Colin was saying, exactly. We've got Bad Mats 89, no one wins in war. We've got Carlos Domingo, China needs to focus on its own issues instead of bullying Asian neighbors. And so it goes on, quite a lot more on those. So.
A lot of people weighing in on a question, China and the Philippines, Asia's next hot war. Maybe this is a good time to go around and just, if everyone has takeaways or thoughts, and then we also want Richard and Colin's sort of takeaways over the last hour as well. But Alex?
Well, I think that what I had never seen before was the rust bucket of that Filipino naval ship that was originally American, called the Sierra Madre.
Maybe we can show it one last time.
And I just find it extraordinary that the Philippines is sort of using that to try to basically to bags a sandbank, to bags a piece of land something in the sea. And I just find that whole concept mind-blowing. That plus these fishermen stroke militia, it's just incredible what's actually going on if you don't know and you're not interested.
Michelle's pulled it up.
There it is. I just find that amazing that it's still floating.
Let's keep that up while we go to Michelle.
Sure. I have to go back to the comments and something that Colin said for my takeaway. He said do your research. And that goes back to a comment that North 4545 said, basically referencing that he found it amusing women talking about war. Well, as we all know, war has really affected the lives of all genders here in Europe when we're talking about the invasion of Ukraine. And so, we're talking about potential scenarios here, but everybody really needs to be aware and do their research of what's happening so we can be aware of these events that are shaping our very interesting times.
yeah, I think that rust bucket ship was my takeaway as well. I'm going to copy you, Alex, and also just touch on Michelle. We just had the comment, no one wins in war, and that really is absolutely the case. That's probably my takeaway.
And for me, Richard, I have to say, I really love that term, strategic gaslighting. So, I think I'll try to use it at some point myself. But over to you guys, sort of like takeaways you guys have had from either people's comments that we've shared and this conversation. I know that you spend a lot of time thinking about this, but, one big top line or something, Colin, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, okay, just one very quick thought, especially with respect to the whole issue of fear mongering and whatnot. I think, I agree that no one wins if there's a war. However, everyone wins if everyone obeys international law. I think what's more important here is things will get better if China obeys international law. I think simple as that. Thank you.
Thank you. Richard.
Well, thank you for mentioning that. I mean, you're free to check my copyright on that term, but thank you. No, no. Let me first of all, let me first strongman my government. I mean, after all, I've been criticizing the Philippines for quite some time, and in this show alone. But actually, that may be rusty and ugly on the outside, but they may have better internet inside than my internet over the past hour or so. So there have been efforts by the Philippine government to fortify that feature. So we may be seeing a better version of that inside and out in the coming years or so. So do not judge a marine detachment by its rusty, tetanus-friendly exterior. But let me just end on this point. Uh, what's interesting is we didn't mention this a while ago, but China's 9-line, 10-line, whatever you call it, comes from Taiwan, or to be more specific about it, Chiang Kai-shek and the Kuomintang, who founded modern Taiwan, right? Yes, I'm just saying, yeah. And let's be also clear about this. I mean, I love them back in time. I'm just saying. So China's not even original about that. But what's interesting is that they never clarified the exact coordinates of that 9-line or 10-line. As bad as that is, that also means China wants to negotiate that down the point. Because if they were to clarify the exact coordinate, they would have locked in themselves, especially with all the popular nationalism and patriotic education that Colin correctly pointed out. Last point, this issue with the Philippines, even if it doesn't lead to war, it says a lot about China as a rising superpower. China is presenting itself as a peacemaker in the Middle East, a peacemaker, I don't know, in Ukraine, all around the world. But if it's not a peacemaker or a source of peace in its own backyard, in its own supposed backyard, and in East Asia and South China Sea, then perhaps that should be a wake-up call for the rest of the world, including you guys in Europe.
Thank you.
Alex, just quickly, Charles M in the chat talking again about that rust bucket ship, the Sierra Madre. It's no longer a ship; it's part of the coral. He says, and also just picking up on what Colin had said about that law, the 2016 law. Biz Kings says, no matter how strong China's military, a law is a law. Philippines is legal. China is squatting in this territory. So that is what that comment has just come through. Yeah.
Well, Richard Heydarian, Colin Coe, thank you so much for joining us. It's late over there, so should bid you adieu and have a sweet dreams, no nightmares of South China Sea conflicts. We're really grateful for this.
Pleasure, guys, always. And great to join Colin again. Hopefully, can have both of us in the future. I'll behave myself better if it's a better hour. Thank you.
Thanks so much, guys.
Good to share the same panel as you. Yeah. See you, Richard. And see you guys.
See you guys. Thank you, Sean.
Well, it's been a great chat. I've learned so much.
Okay, guys, magsasorry lang ako na na-cut tayo kanina kasi I was doing all of this Kiboloy and Robin Padilla and whatnot kind of analysis, and then boom, the next thing we know, and tinatawag na tayo ng mga alaman na to. So this is, by the way, guys, on Deutsche Welle. This is the German international news channel. So you can check this online. So meron silang bagong program na stream. I was told about it the other night. So sabi ko, sige, gawin natin ito. But as you know, it's super late na ngayon dito sa Pilipinas. Dito sa Osaka, sa Japan. It's midnight already. So kung medyo sabog yung answer natin, which I don't think so. I think pretty decent yung answers natin. Then pasensya na lang, just in case. And pasensya na lang kung medyo late din tayo nag-start kanina. Medyo nag-escalate late ako. I didn't know they're gonna call me so early. So I thought we had around 30 minutes to talk proper about Kiboloy, about Robin Hood and all. As I said, as much as I keep track of everything that is happening internationally, of course, that's why we're going all around the world. I'm being invited here and there. I talk to experts and friends all around the world, to officials around the world. And God willing, inshallah, also they're in Europe, in Berlin soon. among others, it's because of the West Philippines International first. But the thing is, I also, parati ko tinitignan also ano nangyayari sa loob ng ating bansa, dahil mahalaga po. Dahil kung hindi tayo isang matatag na republika, kung hindi po maayos ang ating governance, hindi po maayos ang ating mga liderato, kung distracted po tayo sa kung ano-anong mga issue, kung trip lang parati yung mga pinag-usapan natin, good luck na lang sa Pilipinas. Talagang lagot tayo dyan, di ba? Kaya para sa akin, mahalaga na kahit kung ikaw ay isang supposed expert sa international affairs, ikaw ay supposedly, pang-international, global, etc. Yeah, maganda yan. Ginagawa ko rin yan. Matagal na. Bago pa si BBM nagta-travel, ginagawa na natin yan ng, bilang isang eksperto, of course. Hindi bilang anak ng isang dating presidente, naging presidente ulit. But as I said, mahalaga talaga na you pay attention to what's happening on the domestic front. So I hope guys you appreciate itong little effort ko, my perfect effort. Sinisqueeze ko into my schedule, everything. Just kaninang anong oras pa ako gising ngayon, kailangan ko umalis ng mamaya ulit ng maaga. So I hope you appreciate what we're doing here. So you can see talaga sinisqueezing natin as much as possible to get the message across. To get the word across, to engage with you guys. Tinitignan ko actually message, in fact, ni-raise ko yung issue ng Taiwan. Salamat kay Peekaboo, na minention niya yung Republic of China. Well, technically not Republic of China, but it's more like Chiang Kai-shek, Kuomintang. But you get what I'm saying. So I'm doing my best here. So I hope guys nakikita niyo yung effort natin, and I hope guys tuloy-tuloy ang inyong suporta sa ginagawa natin. Hindi sa akin personally. I hope it's the intention that matters, diba? Kaya kahit ako mismo hindi magaling parate, hindi maayos parate, or hindi magaling, whatever, sana yung ginagawa natin ay maging inspirasyon para sa ating mga ibang kababayan, mga ibang magaling dyan, ibang talagang mga bayani dyan. Hindi yung bayani na yung mga international award na media, ganyan. Hindi yung mga totoong bayani natin. Sana, ito lang mga gawa natin. This is the little thing I can do. So God bless. Maraming salamat guys, and thank you so much, and talk to you soon. God willing.